Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. I'm Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And in this video, I'm going to be unpacking the little bit more detail about Chapter 2 of my book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science, published with Oxford University Press. So Chapter 2 is titled Putting Aging on the Radar. This is actually the third in an installment of videos I've made on Chapter 2. The first one was on the aging of humanity, and in the second one, it was explanation of the benefits and drawbacks of the health span concept. And in this final video for Chapter 2, I'm going to address the three major scientific disputes that have made the aspiration of rate control both a scientifically feasible and morally laudable aspiration for medical science in the 21st century. All right, so I'm going to address three major scientific disputes. The first two of these disputes have been resolved to the extent that any scientific dispute could be resolved. The third is ongoing, though there's been some partial resolution. These three scientific disputes make clear why wisdom inquiry science necessitates that we steer the steamship of public health towards the ideal of rate control and transition from trying to increase lifespan to actually increasing health span for the global populations of the world. This was captured in the tale of the journey through the ocean of longevity as stage 2 of the journey. And I'm going to unpack how these three scientific disputes have made this both a scientifically feasible and also morally laudable aspiration for medical science. The first of these scientific disputes is whether or not there's a biological limit to human longevity, and the data has come in. This was a big debate in the 1990s into the 2000s, and I think now it's conclusively resolved that yes, not surprisingly, there is a biological limit, and the fact that there is a biological limit to human longevity necessitates that the steamship of modern public health steer a course towards trying to redress the rate of biological aging itself, rather than simply trying to increase lifespan by preventing or delaying all causes of death. The second dispute was whether or not single genetic mutations could influence the rate of aging, at least in animal experiments. And again, the answer there is conclusively a yes. And finally, the third scientific dispute concerns the question, what are the hallmarks of aging that demonstrate that an intervention, both non-pharmacological or pharmacological, has actually slowed the rate of biological aging? This is a complicated, still ongoing debate, but I think at least there's enough of a consensus to show that in principle, biological aging can be slowed, though a lot of detail still remains to be resolved. I think it's fair to say that there is a scientific consensus that biological aging can be slowed with certain interventions, but still a lot of epistemic uncertainty and disagreement concerning other types of intervention. All right, so the first scientific dispute, this is one that took place among demographers concerning the future trends of increases in life expectancy for human populations. Would life expectancy continue up this escalator indefinitely, or would it eventually slow down and hit a limit? And this really has important significance for determining what the appropriate moral aspirations of medical science should be in an aging world. In the tale of the journey through the ocean of longevity, the ship's captain believes that once they've overcome the infectious disease waves, that it would be smooth sailing further up the ocean of longevity. And this actually was the presupposition of the initial war against disease. Many of the early public health pioneers believed that public health was purchasable, and that if you just improved living conditions and ensured that there was sanitation and vaccinations, populations would just continue to survive into later and later life in a healthy state. After the waves of infectious disease had been overcome, there was an onset of new waves of disease, the chronic conditions of later life, that then began to pummel the ship. Now, the presupposition of the war against disease and Charles Winslow's view that you could adopt a protean approach to public health, believed that you could just target the chronic conditions in the same way that you targeted the infectious diseases. And while we have made success in delaying mortality from diseases like cancer, heart disease, and stroke, we are not going to be able to abate them like we did with many of the infectious diseases responsible for early life mortality. At least they're not likely to be eradicated. The health dividend of delaying mortality from the chronic conditions of late life becomes smaller and smaller because of the onset of multimorbidity in late life. And that stands in stark contrast to the health dividend of eradicating or reducing the very high rates of early life mortality from infectious disease. So the ship's journey through the ocean of longevity is not an open ocean like this image here. On the distant horizon is the iceberg, representing the limit to human longevity. And medical science must then start to strategize about how it can promote health span and lifespan in a world where human populations are surviving to the upper limits of human longevity. In the tail of the journey through the ocean of longevity, the ship's captain initially adopts the perspective of those demographers, the optimistic demographers, who believe that the past predicts the future. That is, that if you made 30 years, if you had a 30-year increase in life expectancy in the 20th century by abating the mortality risk from infectious disease, you could anticipate getting a similar magnitude of increase in life expectancy in the 21st century. This is the approach of the statistician and mathematician, that it's really about crunching numbers and drawing inferences about the future based on progress made in the past. However, saving the young from an early death confers a much different impact on lifespan and health span than reducing any specific cause of mortality in late life, given the plurality of multimorbidity for populations surviving beyond the 7th decade of life. So this first camp, the past predicts the future camp, was represented in a series of published articles, most notably by James Voppel. There's a piece in Nature and The Lancet where he makes estimates that actually most of the children born in countries like Canada, my home country, would survive to 100 years life expectancy. And now the idea that, my children's generation is going to be surviving decades longer than my generation is really a far-fetched scenario unless some modulation to the rate of aging is achieved. So this was the optimistic estimates that increases in average life expectancy would continue at the same rate that they were in the past, with no signs of slowing. If these predictions were accurate, then the steamship of public health could simply follow the same route that it originally took to abate the infectious disease mortality risks, namely trying to mitigate the proximate causation of disease and death. However, because the biology of aging is implicated in our vulnerability to most of the chronic conditions in later life, it's going to require some outside-the-box thinking in terms of what the aspirations of medical science ought to be in an aging world. So this is what the landscape actually looks like. It was not smooth sailing of further increases up the ocean of longevity, but in fact, we've come up against the iceberg, which is responsible for the onset of most of the chronic conditions, frailty, and disability that older populations are vulnerable to in the 7th and 8th decade of life. And so geroscience brings into focus the significance of targeting the biology of aging itself to try to increase the opportunities for healthy longevity for today's aging populations. So a second camp of demographers argued that there was a biological limit to human longevity, and more importantly, to healthy longevity, because that's ultimately what matters the most. And so the model for this camp is that biology trumps math, right? You might be able to crunch numbers about how life expectancy has increased in the 20th century when early life mortality was abated. But that doesn't mean it's going to be an accurate prediction about what's going to happen for the older populations surviving to those ages where the onset of chronic conditions becomes much more prevalent. And you can draw on insights from comparative biology. You can take mice, for example, in the laboratory. They don't just continue to live indefinitely with an extended duration of health span when you reduce the risks of predation and starvation. In fact, they age in very similar ways to humans. They get cancer, for example. So I covered this debate in a previous video between Vaupel and Olshansky that was covered in Science, a pitched battle over lifespan. And this debate, I believe now, is resolved. The realist camp, represented by Olshansky, has been vindicated. That is, that there's a biological limit of how long human populations can survive, and more importantly, how long they can remain healthy. The journey through the ocean of longevity is not open, calm waters for populations surviving past the 7th decade in life. Instead, there's an onslaught of chronic conditions implicated by the rate of biological aging itself. So this first scientific debate among demographers holds really critical insight for what the ideals of medical science ought to be. If it were the case that the initial war against disease simply translated into further increases of life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, then the steamship of public health would have no reason to consider adopting a different strategy. But in fact, what has happened is that progress has slowed and a growing gap has emerged between lifespan and health span. And that really is the main reason why we need to reconceptualize what the ideals of medical science ought to be in an aging world. So I noted this in the prologue video to The Tale. One of the key bits of information that I try to convey in The Tale of the Journey Through the Ocean of Longevity is the deceleration of increases in life expectancy. And the latest analysis of this came out in Nature Aging in 2024, another paper co-authored by Olshansky and colleagues that looked at the reality that in the 8 countries with the longest lived populations, improvements overall have been decelerating. So contrary to many people's intuitions, the richest countries in the world are reaping the smallest increases in life expectancy because their populations are already approaching the upper bounds of human longevity. And most of the improvements in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy are being made in those regions of the world that still have higher rates of early life mortality. So this first scientific dispute amplifies the moral imperative to redress the growing health span lifespan gap, which, as we can see, is nearly a decade of life throughout the world. It's higher for women than it is for men by nearly 2.5 years. And so the ideal of rate control becomes so critical because without addressing this disparity, at best, we're going to be exacerbating that inequality even further so that we delay death into later and later life so that older populations become more susceptible to more debilitating conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. All right, so let us move on to the second scientific dispute that I address in this chapter. Could a single genetic mutation alter the rate of aging, at least in animal experiments? So this really is a kind of a proof of principle that biomedical science could be deployed to manipulate the rate of aging to confer not so much an increase in lifespan, but much more importantly, an increase in health span. In the early 1990s, the conventional view would have been that it was very unlikely that something as complicated as aging could be modulated intentionally by tweaking a particular gene or a few number of genes. And here's a passage then from a piece co-authored by Linda Partridge, and I'll show an updated quotation in a moment, that the polygenetic nature of aging contains a baleful message for gerontologists. It is most unlikely that engineering of a few genes or intervention in a handful of physiological pathways will prevent the process from occurring. All right, so in the early 1990s, it looked like aging was just too complicated to actually be able to intentionally modulate the rate of aging. And while preventing aging from occurring is too much of a bold aspiration, the idea of slowing aging was demonstrated at exactly the same time that this conjecture that it was unlikely to occur. So this within a year of this publication appearing in Nature, we found experiments were published showing that you could actually slow down the rate of biological aging in roundworms and in mice. These are my drawings on my computer of a roundworm and a mouse. You could actually significantly increase lifespan through the genetic manipulation of worms and mice. So by 2010, Partridge herself then remarked that perhaps the single most important advance in aging research in recent years has been the discovery of mutations in single genes that extend the lifespan of laboratory animals. And what's really fascinating about this scientific experiments on roundworms and in yeast and in mice and in fruit flies was not simply that it increased the duration of life, but it actually increased the duration of healthy life. And so within a very short period of time, as it became possible to manipulate particular genes, aging research revealed actually feasible to make a meaningful impact on health span by targeting a small subset of particular genetic mutations. So this second scientific dispute about whether or not it's possible to manipulate the rate of aging genetically makes the aspiration of rate control a scientifically feasible goal. Now, the goal is not, as I detail in later chapters of the book, to do genetic engineering on humans, but rather to develop drugs that mimic the effects of genetic manipulation and caloric restriction, which have been shown to increase lifespan and health span by slowing the rate of biological aging. So developing molecules that mimic the effects of what occurs when genetic manipulation to increase lifespan and health span occurs. Right? So that is the second scientific dispute. It's the one that encourages us to then prime the idealism of rate control as a scientifically feasible as well as morally laudable aspiration. Thirdly, is the question of what are the hallmarks of aging? So suppose a scientist proposes that some intervention, be it a diet, exercise, or a drug, actually slows aging. How could you validate it? How could you validate that? What would be the empirical evidence that an intervention actually slows aging? This is a really complicated issue for the field of translational gerontology. And because aging is something that occurs throughout the lifespan, and especially for a species like humans that survive, beyond the 8th decade of life, there's no way you could just sit around waiting for scientific experiments conducted over 60 years to see whether or not people survive longer with better health. So you use laboratory species that don't survive very long, so yeast, worms, fruit flies, rodents, but also you look for biomarkers that indicate, that provide evidence that the rate of senescence seems to be slowed, and this confers a health benefit. So this is referred to as biomarkers or the hallmarks of aging. So unlike a drug that's designed to treat a specific disease, like a cancer tumor, you can look for markers like, is the cancer tumor shrinking, or at least no longer growing? Whereas for aging, you can't just point to a simple thing and say, oh, the rate of aging has been slowed. So the field of geroscience has united around a kind of ever-expanding hallmarks of aging. There was an initial paper in 2013 and then subsequently updated a decade later to include a whole bunch of molecular and cellular level phenomena that are implicated in measuring the epigenetics of aging. So, the length of the telomeres, cellular senescence, chronic inflammation. And while this third scientific debate is still ongoing, And serious research still needs to be done to come up with a consensus about the credible biomarkers for biological aging. What has been gathered so far provides momentum for the rate of aging as a credible scientific aspiration. And what it has revealed is that there are epigenetic clocks, that while everybody chronologically ages at the same rate, there's great variation in the rate of biological aging, right? So none of us biologically age at the same rate. It's influenced both by our unique genetics as well as the environment in which we live, our lifestyle, and could also be modulated pharmacologically. So this third scientific dispute is a critical one to make the aspiration of translational gerontology, especially the development of drugs, geroprotective drugs to slow down aging, scientifically feasible. The field still has a lot of work to do in terms of clarifying what the hallmarks of biological aging are to ensure that any interventions that are purported to slow biological aging are empirically valid. So that is the culmination of 3 short videos that give you a bird's eye view of some of the themes that arise in Chapter 2, titled Putting Aging on the Radar. I've covered the aging of humanity. I've offered some reflections on the pros and cons of the health span concept, and I've surveyed the 3 major scientific disputes that have mostly been resolved and lead to the conclusion I have argued that the ideal of rate control deserves to be a primary aspiration for medical science in the 21st century.